Warsaw, Poland. 1943. Three men in crisp black Gestapo uniforms stride through the iron gates of the Warsaw Ghetto, their boots echoing against the cobblestones with the authority of death itself. SS guards snap to attention, their arms shooting up in salute. The uniforms are perfect, the swastikas gleaming, the peaked caps casting shadows over hard faces. But underneath those death's head insignias, beneath those immaculate Nazi disguises, beat the hearts of three Catholic monks who have never held a weapon in their lives. They are walking into the most heavily guarded Nazi stronghold in occupied Poland. And if anyone discovers who they really are, they will not simply be shot. They will be tortured for information about the underground network, then executed slowly as an example. Every second they remain inside these walls, they are one wrong word, one suspicious glance, one missed detail away from a fate worse than death. The Warsaw Ghetto in 1943 was not just a prison. It was hell on earth, a 7-square-mile cage holding nearly 500,000 Jews crammed into streets designed for 50,000. The Nazis had erected 10-foot walls topped with broken glass and barbed wire, sealing off an entire section of the city and transforming it into humanity's largest death trap. Inside, families starved in plain sight. Children with distended bellies begged for crusts of bread. Corpses lay in the streets each morning, covered with newspapers, waiting for the daily collection carts. The air itself smelled of disease, desperation, and smoke from the crematoria that never stopped burning. This was the Nazis' laboratory of extermination, a place where they perfected the machinery of genocide before shipping their methods to Treblinka, Auschwitz, and beyond. By 1943, the deportations had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and everyone knew the truth. The trains heading east were not going to work camps. They were going to gas chambers. But tucked away in the Christian quarter of Warsaw, just beyond those walls of death, stood a quiet Franciscan monastery where three brothers refused to accept the unacceptable. Father Maximilian Kolbe had already been martyred in Auschwitz 2 years earlier, having volunteered to die in place of a stranger, but his spirit of radical sacrifice had infected the entire order. Among the remaining monks were three men whose names history has nearly forgotten, men who prayed the rosary each morning and then spent their afternoons forging Nazi identification papers. They were not spies. They were not soldiers. They were simple men of God who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and they had decided that obedience to Christ meant disobedience to Hitler. They had watched from their monastery windows as the ghetto walls went up. They had heard the screams when the SS conducted their actions, storming through the streets and dragging families from their hiding places. And they had made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone with common sense. They would go inside. The plan was audacious to the point of suicide. Nazi officers were meticulously documented, their identities cross-referenced, their movements tracked. The SS was not just an army. It was a cult of brutal efficiency where everyone knew everyone, where paperwork was sacred, where the wrong stamp or signature could end a man's life. Yet these three monks had somehow acquired genuine Gestapo uniforms, likely stripped from dead officers or purchased from black market dealers who asked no questions. They had studied the mannerisms, the way SS men walked with that particular swagger of impunity, the way they barked orders with casual cruelty, the way they looked at Jews not as human beings, but as vermin to be processed. They had forged transfer orders and identification papers that could fool a quick inspection, though they would never survive a thorough investigation. And they had memorized a list of addresses inside the ghetto, specific buildings where Jewish families were hiding their children in crawl spaces and false walls, waiting for the inevitable moment when the Nazis would come to drag them onto the cattle cars heading east. Now, on this particular morning in the spring of 1943, those three monks crossed the threshold from the world of the living into the realm of the damned. The ghetto was in the midst of its final liquidation. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising had just been crushed, and SS Commander Jürgen Stroop was methodically burning the district block by block, flushing out the last survivors like rats from a flooding ship. Smoke filled the sky. Machine gun fire echoed between the buildings. Jewish resistance fighters were making their last stand with homemade Molotov cocktails against German tanks. Into this apocalypse walked 3 men in enemy uniforms, carrying nothing but forged papers and an unshakable faith that God would blind the eyes of their enemies. They did not know if they would survive the next hour. They only knew that dozens of Jewish children were trapped inside, and if someone did not reach them before the final sweep, those children would burn alive or be shipped to Treblinka in the morning. The first checkpoint was 50 feet ahead. A young SS guard with cold blue eyes stepped forward, his hand moving to his holster. The lead monk, his heart hammering so hard he was certain it could be heard through his stolen uniform, reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the forged documents. His hand did not shake. His voice did not waver. And in perfect German, with the arrogance of a man who believed himself to be on the winning side of history, he spoke the words that would either save dozens of lives or end his own in the next 30 seconds. This is where their story truly begins, in that moment between worlds, where faith confronted pure evil and decided it would not blink first. The guard glanced at the papers, his eyes scanning the official stamps and signatures with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had checked thousands of such documents. The monastery's forger had done his work well. Every detail was perfect, from the eagle and swastika embossed at the top to the purple ink of the authorization stamp. The guard's expression remained neutral, bored even, as he waved them through without a second thought. The 3 monks walked forward, their boots clicking in unison against the pavement, and the moment they passed beyond the guard's line of sight, each man felt his lungs release air he had not realized he was holding. They were inside. They had crossed the first barrier between the world of the perpetrators and the world of the victims, and now there was no turning back. Behind them, the gate clanged shut with the finality of a coffin lid, sealing them inside the largest killing ground in Nazi-occupied Europe. To understand why these 3 men risked everything requires understanding what Warsaw had become by 1943. Before the war, Warsaw had been called the Paris of the East, a glittering cosmopolitan center where Jews and Christians lived side by side, where synagogues stood next to churches, where Jewish doctors treated Polish patients and Polish teachers educated Jewish students. The city had been home to the largest Jewish community in Europe, nearly 400,000 souls who contributed to every aspect of Polish life. They were lawyers and laborers, musicians and merchants, scholars and shopkeepers. Then came September 1939, when German tanks rolled through the streets and the Nazi occupation began. Within months, the systematic destruction of Jewish life commenced with bureaucratic precision. First came the identification requirements, forcing every Jew to wear a white armband with a blue Star of David. Then came the confiscations, stripping Jewish families of their businesses and property. Then came the walls. The ghetto was established in October 1940, and its creation was a masterpiece of Nazi cruelty disguised as administrative necessity. The Germans claimed they were isolating Jews for public health reasons, to prevent the spread of typhus. But everyone knew the truth. This was a holding pen, a way station designed to concentrate the Jewish population before their ultimate disposal. Families were given hours to pack their lives into suitcases and move behind the walls. Christian Poles who lived in the designated area were relocated out. Jewish families from surrounding areas were relocated in. Within weeks, the ghetto held nearly 500,000 people crammed into an area of just over 1 square mile. Apartments meant for 4 people now housed 40. Disease spread like wildfire through the overcrowded tenements. Food rations were set at starvation levels, intentionally calculated to provide only 600 calories per day, just enough to keep people alive long enough to be useful for labor before they died of malnutrition. By 1942, the deportations began in earnest. The Nazis called it resettlement, claiming Jews were being transferred to work camps in the East. They posted notices promising jobs, bread and marmalade to those who volunteered for transport. But the underground network had received reports from escaped prisoners and Polish railroad workers. The trains were not going to work camps. They were going to a place called Treblinka, where a factory of death operated 24 hours a day, where Jews were herded into gas chambers disguised as showers and murdered with carbon monoxide from diesel engines. Between July and September 1942, The Nazis deported nearly 300,000 Jews from Warsaw to Treblinka. Only a handful survived. The ghetto's population, once nearly 500,000, had been reduced to fewer than 60,000 by the spring of 1943. The three monks knew all of this. They had received reports from the underground, from the Zagota Council that coordinated rescue efforts, from Jewish resistance fighters who smuggled messages through the sewers. They knew that time had run out, that the final liquidation of the ghetto was underway, and that within days, perhaps hours, there would be no one left to save. The children they sought were hidden in bunkers and false walls, the sons and daughters of families who had entrusted them to smugglers and resistance fighters in desperate final acts of hope. These children were the last remnants of a civilization being systematically erased, and if the monks failed, those children would become smoke rising from chimneys, numbers in a ledger of industrialized murder. So they walked deeper into the ghetto, three men in stolen uniforms, following a hand-drawn map to addresses where innocents waited in darkness, praying that monsters dressed as men would somehow pass them by. The streets of the ghetto assaulted the senses in ways no human being should ever witness. Bodies lay where they had fallen, too numerous for the burial details to collect. Skeletal children sat motionless in doorways, their eyes hollow and ancient, staring at nothing. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of human waste, rotting flesh, and the acrid smoke that poured from burning buildings where SS troops were systematically setting fires to flush out hidden Jews. German soldiers moved through the ruins with flamethrowers, incinerating entire blocks. Machine gun nests had been set up at major intersections, their barrels trained on the rubble where resistance fighters still hid. This was not a military operation. This was extermination choreographed with Teutonic efficiency, and the three monks walked through it wearing the uniforms of the executioners, each step a betrayal of everything their eyes were witnessing. They had to maintain their disguise at all costs, which meant they could not react. When an SS officer kicked a starving woman who had collapsed in the street, they had to keep walking. When they passed a group of soldiers dragging a family from a basement hiding place, the parents screaming as children were torn from their arms, they had to look away with the casual indifference of men who saw this as routine work. Every fiber of their being screamed to intervene, to throw off these cursed uniforms and stand with the victims, but they forced themselves to remember the mission. Dozens of children were waiting in hidden locations throughout the ghetto, and if these three monks broke character now, if they revealed themselves as imposters, those children would die. So they walked on, their faces masks of German coldness, while their hearts shattered with every step. This was the terrible calculus of resistance under Nazi occupation. Sometimes saving lives required walking past those you could not save, becoming complicit in evil to prevent greater evil, wearing the face of the devil to do God's work. The lead monk, who we will call Brother Stefan, though that may not have been his real name, carried a leather briefcase that contained the forged transfer documents. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would present themselves as Gestapo officers, conducting a special operation to identify children of strategic value for interrogation about underground activities. The documents authorized them to remove selected children from the ghetto for processing at Gestapo headquarters. It was exactly the kind of arbitrary cruelty the SS practiced daily, plausible enough that nobody would question it. The buildings on their list were scattered throughout the ghetto, requiring them to traverse the entire killing ground while maintaining their cover. They had perhaps 3 hours before someone in the Nazi chain of command noticed that 3 Gestapo officers nobody had ever seen before were wandering around without proper authorization. 3 hours to find and extract as many children as possible before their luck ran out. The first address was a partially destroyed apartment building on Myler Street, one of the last areas still resisting the German onslaught. They could hear gunfire echoing from nearby blocks where Jewish fighters from the ZOB, the Jewish Combat Organization, were making their final stand. These resistance fighters knew they could not win. They knew they would all die. But they had decided that if death was inevitable, they would choose how they died. They would die fighting, taking as many Nazis with them as possible, denying the Germans the satisfaction of herding them like cattle onto trains. The uprising had shocked the Nazi command, They had expected the liquidation to take 3 days. It had now stretched into weeks, with ragged Jewish fighters armed with pistols and homemade explosives holding off German tanks and trained troops. The monks had to navigate through this battlefield, and every moment they remained in the open increased the risk that they would be caught in crossfire, or questioned by an SS officer who actually knew the faces of the real Gestapo agents. Brother Stefan approached the building's entrance, where a Jewish policeman stood guard. These Jewish police were tragic figures, men forced to collaborate with the Nazis in exchange for temporary survival for themselves and their families. They wore blue caps and armbands, and they enforced Nazi orders against their own people, a devil's bargain that bought them nothing in the end except guilt and an extra few months of life before they too were shipped to Treblinka. The policeman saw the Gestapo uniforms and immediately stepped aside, his face draining of color. He knew what Gestapo visits meant. Brother Stefan nodded curtly and pushed past him into the darkened stairwell, his 2 companions following close behind. They climbed the stairs quickly, their boots echoing in the empty building. On the 3rd floor, they found the apartment number written on their map. Brother Stefan knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. It was the signal. From behind the door came the sound of furniture being moved, and then a crack of light appeared, as the door opened just enough for desperate eyes to peer out into the hallway. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 30 years old. Though starvation and terror had aged her face into something ancient, her eyes widened in horror when she saw the Gestapo uniforms, and she stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Brother Stefan had prepared for this moment, knowing that the sight of SS uniforms would trigger pure panic. He raised his hand slowly and spoke in Polish, not German, his voice barely above a whisper. He told her they were not Nazis. He told her they had come from Father Wojciech at the monastery. He told her they had come to take the children to safety. The woman stared at him, her mind struggling to process the impossible contradiction before her eyes. Nazi uniforms, Polish words, a promise of rescue. It made no sense, and in the ghetto, things that made no sense were usually traps designed to extract information before the killing began. Brother Stefan understood her hesitation. Trust had been murdered in this place along with everything else. The Nazis had used every form of deception imaginable. They had dressed Jewish collaborators in German uniforms to infiltrate resistance cells. They had promised food to lure starving families into ambushes. They had posted notices guaranteeing safe passage to work camps, only to send those who volunteered directly to gas chambers. Why should this woman believe that 3 men in Gestapo uniforms were actually monks risking their lives to save Jewish children? Brother Stefan reached into his coat, moving slowly so as not to alarm her, and withdrew a small wooden rosary. He held it up where she could see it, the beads worn smooth from decades of prayer. Then he pulled down his collar slightly, revealing the edge of the brown Franciscan habit he wore beneath the stolen Nazi uniform. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She nodded once, quickly, and pulled the door open wide enough for them to enter. The apartment was nearly empty, stripped of furniture and belongings. A single candle burned in the corner, casting shadows that danced across walls scarred by bullet holes from previous Nazi raids. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a makeshift curtain made from a torn bedsheet, huddled 6 children ranging in age from perhaps 4 to 12 years old. They were silent, absolutely silent, trained by weeks of hiding to make no sound at all. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes too large in their starved features, their clothes hanging off bodies that had been reduced to skin stretched over bone. When they saw the German uniforms, several of them pressed themselves against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. The oldest girl, perhaps 12, positioned herself in front of the younger ones, her thin arms spread wide in a futile gesture of protection. She was ready to die first, if it meant buying the little ones a few more seconds of life. Brother Stefan knelt down, removing his peaked Gestapo cap and setting it on the floor. He spoke to the children in Polish, his voice gentle, explaining who they really were and why they had come. He told them they were going to walk out of the ghetto disguised as prisoners, being transferred for interrogation. He told them they needed to look afraid, which would not be difficult, and they needed to remain absolutely silent, which they had already mastered. He told them that when they reached the monastery, there would be food and beds and safety. The children stared at him with eyes that had seen too much, eyes that no longer believed in fairy tales about safety or food or futures. But the oldest girl stepped forward. She asked a single question. She asked if this was real, if they would truly escape, or if this was another Nazi trick designed to give them hope before crushing it. Brother Stefan looked into her eyes and made a promise he had no guarantee he could keep. He told her it was real, that God had sent them, and that before nightfall they would be free. The woman who had hidden the children moved quickly now, wrapping them in whatever rags could pass for coats, whispering instructions and final blessings. 2 of the children were her own. The others belonged to families who had already been deported or killed, entrusted to her in those final moments when parents realized they would not survive, but desperately hoped their children might. She kissed each child on the forehead, a benediction and a goodbye. Then she turned to Brother Stefan and gripped his arm with surprising strength. She made him swear an oath, right there in that destroyed apartment with the sound of gunfire echoing outside. She made him swear that if he got these children out, he would make sure the world remembered what happened here. She made him swear that their names would not be erased, that someone would tell the story of Warsaw, that the 6 million would not become a number, but would remain human beings with faces and names and futures that were stolen. Brother Stefan swore it. Then he and his 2 companions gathered the children and prepared to walk back out into hell. The return journey through the ghetto streets required a performance of such chilling precision that one mistake would result in immediate execution for everyone involved. Brother Stefan arranged the children in a single file line, and his 2 companion monks took positions at the front and rear. They had to make this look like a routine prisoner transfer, which meant the children had to appear frightened and the monks had to appear cruel. Brother Stefan barked orders in German, his voice harsh and commanding, words that meant nothing but sounded appropriately threatening. The children, already terrified beyond measure, needed no coaching to look like prisoners being marched to their doom. They walked with heads down, shoulders hunched, the very picture of defeated humanity that the Nazis had spent years creating. The performance was hideously convincing because it was barely a performance at all. They moved quickly through the burning streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where German units were conducting systematic building-by-building searches. The smoke provided cover, thick clouds that reduced visibility and made it difficult to see faces clearly. They passed other SS units who barely glanced at them, too focused on their own operations to question 3 more Gestapo officers moving prisoners through the chaos. At one point, a Wehrmacht lieutenant actually nodded in approval as they passed, apparently impressed by the efficiency of these officers who had managed to capture an entire group of hidden children. Brother Stefan nodded back, his face an iron mask, while inside his mind screamed prayers for forgiveness for every second he wore this uniform and played this role. They were 3 blocks from the gate when their luck finally wavered. An SS captain emerged from a side street accompanied by 2 subordinates and called out for them to halt. He was young, perhaps 25, with the cruel precision of a true believer who had risen quickly through Nazi ranks by demonstrating exceptional brutality. He approached with the swagger of absolute authority, his eyes scanning the children with the detached interest of a farmer inspecting livestock. He demanded to see their transfer orders. Brother Stefan reached into his briefcase with steady hands, withdrawing the forged documents while maintaining eye contact with the captain. He handed over the papers with the casual confidence of a man who had every right to be there. And the captain began reading, his finger tracing each line with agonizing slowness. Seconds stretched into eternities. One of the children, a small boy no more than 5 years old, began to whimper softly. The captain's eyes snapped up from the documents. The child's fear had broken through the silence, and now the captain was staring at the boy with sudden interest. He stepped closer, ignoring Brother Stefan entirely, and bent down to look into the child's face. He asked the boy a question in German, something casual about his name. The boy understood no German and stared back mutely, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked cheeks. The captain's expression shifted. Something was wrong and he knew it. His hand moved toward his holster, Brother Stefan had perhaps 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether everyone survived or everyone died. He could not fight his way out. 3 unarmed monks against trained SS officers in the middle of the ghetto, surrounded by hundreds of German soldiers, was suicide. He could not run. The children would never make it. He had only one weapon left, the power of absolute audacity. Brother Stefan exploded into motion, not with violence but with theatrical rage. He unleashed a torrent of German invective at the captain, his voice rising to a furious bellow that echoed off the ruined buildings. He demanded to know if the captain was questioning the direct orders of Gestapo headquarters. He claimed these children were high-value intelligence assets connected to underground leadership. He suggested that the captain's interference with a classified operation would be reported directly to SS Obergruppenführer Stroop himself. He delivered this performance with such convincing fury, with such authentic-seeming outrage at having his authority questioned, that the captain actually took a step backward. The Nazi bureaucracy ran on fear of superior officers and terror of making mistakes that would be noticed by commanders. The captain hesitated, his eyes moving between the documents, the children, and Brother Stefan's face contorted with manufactured anger. He was caught between suspicion and self-preservation. Finally, after a moment that seemed to last 1,000 years, he handed back the documents, saluted stiffly, and stepped aside. The 3 monks and 6 children walked past him toward the gates, and nobody looked back because looking back would reveal the absolute terror that was threatening to collapse their legs beneath them. The final checkpoint at the ghetto gate represented the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. This was where documentation was examined most carefully, where guards had the time and authorization to verify every detail, where suspicious transfers were routinely stopped and investigated. The 3 monks approached with measured steps, the 6 children between them, knowing that behind them lay the burning hell of the ghetto and ahead lay freedom so close they could almost taste it. The guard at the gate was an older Wehrmacht soldier, not SS, a man whose face showed the weariness of someone who had seen too much and participated in things he could never speak about to his family back in Germany. He gestured for them to halt and extended his hand for the transfer documents. Brother Stefan handed them over, his expression bored and impatient, projecting the attitude of a Gestapo officer who considered Wehrmacht guards to be inferior beings whose job was to process paperwork quickly and ask no questions. The guard examined the documents with excruciating care, cross-referencing the authorization codes against a master list he kept in a worn leather binder. His eyes moved from the papers to the children and back again, counting heads, verifying numbers. One of the children, the oldest girl who had asked if this rescue was real, began to sway slightly on her feet, the exhaustion and starvation finally overwhelming her adrenaline. Brother Stefan's companion, the monk we will call Brother Tomasz, moved subtly closer to catch her if she fell, but the movement drew the guard's attention. He looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. He asked a question in German, wanting to know why one of the officers was showing concern for a Jewish prisoner. It was a detail that did not fit the Nazi paradigm, a crack in the performance that could unravel everything. Brother Tomasz responded without hesitation, his German flawless, explaining that the girl possessed critical information about weapons caches, and she was worthless to interrogators if she collapsed and died before questioning. He delivered this explanation with the callous pragmatism of a man discussing damaged equipment rather than a dying child, and the guard seemed satisfied. He returned to examining the documents, flipping through pages, comparing signatures. The tension stretched so tight that Brother Stefan could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears like artillery fire. Everything depended on a forger's skill, on ink and paper, and stamps stolen or replicated in a monastery workshop. If one signature was wrong, if one seal was slightly misaligned, if one authorization code failed to match the master list, they would all be arrested immediately. The children would be shot on the spot as a lesson. The 3 monks would be interrogated to reveal the entire underground network, then executed publicly as traitors and Jew lovers. Finally, after an eternity compressed into 90 seconds, the guard folded the documents and handed them back. He waved them through with a casual gesture, already turning his attention to the next group waiting to exit. Just like that, with bureaucratic indifference, he granted passage from death to life. The 3 monks and 6 children walked through the gate, past the walls topped with broken glass and barbed wire, past the armed guards and watchtowers, out of the Warsaw Ghetto and into the streets of the Aryan side of the city. They maintained their formation for another 3 blocks, continuing the charade until they were safely away from German patrols. Then Brother Stefan led them down a narrow alley and through a maze of back streets toward the monastery. Only when they reached a quiet residential area did they finally allow themselves to pause. Brother Stefan removed his Gestapo cap and threw it against a wall with such force that it left a mark on the brick. The children stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend that they had actually escaped. They had spent weeks or months in hiding, believing they would die in the ghetto like everyone else, that their names would be lost to history, that nobody would remember they had ever existed. Now they stood on the other side of those walls, breathing air that did not smell of smoke and death, looking at a world that continued to function normally, while behind them an entire civilization was being systematically erased. The oldest girl, the one who had asked if this rescue was real, walked up to Brother Stefan and did something unexpected. She reached out and touched the brown Franciscan habit visible beneath his open coat, as if confirming that he truly was what he claimed to be, that this had not been a fever dream born of starvation and desperation. Then she asked another question, one that Brother Stefan had no answer for. She asked why God had saved her when he allowed so many others to die. Brother Stefan looked into her ancient eyes in her child's face and told her the only truth he knew. He told her that he did not understand God's plan, that faith sometimes meant accepting mystery, but that she had survived for a reason, and her life now carried the weight of testimony. She would live to tell the story of those who died. She would be the voice for the voiceless. She would be the memory that refused to be erased. The monastery stood like an island of sanctuary in a city drowning in darkness. Its stone walls, built centuries earlier, had witnessed wars and plagues and empires rising and falling, but nothing in its long history compared to the evil unfolding in 1943 Warsaw. The 3 monks led the children through a side entrance, avoiding the main gates where German patrols occasionally conducted surprise inspections, looking for hidden Jews and resistance members. Inside the courtyard, other monks waited with blankets and warm soup, their faces streaming with tears of relief and joy. They gathered the children into their arms, these men who had taken vows of celibacy and would never have children of their own, and they wept openly at the miracle of 6 young lives snatched from the jaws of mechanized death. The children were taken to a hidden basement room, where false walls concealed a network of chambers that had been prepared for exactly this purpose. They were fed carefully, small amounts at first because their starved bodies could not handle a full meal, and they were given clean clothes and real beds for the first time in months. But the mission was far from over. Those 6 children represented just one apartment, one address on a list that contained dozens more. Brother Stefan and his companions had no time to rest or celebrate. The Gestapo uniforms had worked once, which meant they might work again, but every subsequent use increased the risk of exposure exponentially. Someone in the Nazi bureaucracy would eventually notice inconsistencies in the transfer records. Someone would ask questions about Gestapo officers nobody had ever seen before. Someone would cross-reference authorization codes and discover forgeries. The monks had perhaps 24 hours, maybe less, before their scheme was discovered, and the entire German security apparatus descended on the monastery. They had to extract as many children as possible before that window closed. So, after ensuring the first group was safe, after changing into fresh stolen uniforms because the first set was covered in the soot and blood of the ghetto, the 3 monks prepared to go back inside. Over the next 3 days, they made 7 trips into the Warsaw Ghetto. 7 times they walked through those gates wearing the uniforms of genocidal murderers. 7 times they navigated burning streets and sniper fire and random SS patrols. 7 times they knocked on hidden doors and convinced terrified families to trust men dressed as their executioners. 7 times they marched children past German checkpoints and through a city where a single wrong word meant death. The numbers grew. 6 children became 12. 12 became 20. 20 became 32. Each rescue required new forged documents, new cover stories, new performances of casual Nazi cruelty. The strain was inhuman. Brother Tomasz developed a nervous tremor in his hands that he could not control. The third monk, Brother Karol, began having nightmares so violent that he would wake screaming, reliving the moments when they thought they had been discovered. Brother Stefan aged a decade in those 3 days, his hair beginning to show streaks of white, his face developing lines that had not been there before. The closest call came on their 6th trip, when they were inside an apartment building on WWII Street. They had just collected 4 children from a hidden cellar when they heard boots thundering up the stairwell. Real Gestapo officers, conducting a sweep of the building, were approaching their floor. There was no time to hide and no way to escape. The monks were trapped in a narrow hallway with 4 Jewish children and seconds before discovery. Brother Karol made a decision that saved them all, but cost him something essential from his soul. He grabbed the oldest child, a boy of perhaps 10, and began dragging him roughly toward the stairs while shouting in German about captured resistance youth. When the real Gestapo officers rounded the corner, they saw what appeared to be fellow officers in the middle of an arrest. Brother Karol barked at them to get out of his way, claiming he had priority orders. The real Gestapo officers, conditioned to accept authority without question, actually helped clear the path, holding open doors as Brother Karol and his companions dragged the children down the stairs and out of the building. The ruse worked perfectly. But Brother Karol had been forced to hurt that child, to grip his arm hard enough to leave bruises, to treat him exactly as a real Nazi would, and the look of betrayed terror in the boy's eyes would haunt Brother Karol for the rest of his life. By the evening of the 3rd day, they had rescued 32 children, but the operation was falling apart. The underground network sent word that the Gestapo had discovered discrepancies in transfer records and was investigating. German authorities were asking questions about unauthorized operations in the ghetto. The window was closing. Brother Stefan knew they could make perhaps 1 more trip, maybe 2 if they were extraordinarily lucky, before the entire scheme collapsed and brought destruction down on everyone involved. The monastery was now hiding 32 Jewish children in secret chambers, a violation that would result in the execution of every monk in the building if discovered. They had pushed their luck far beyond any reasonable limit. But there were still names on the list, still children waiting in hidden rooms throughout the ghetto, still families who had been promised rescue and were counting on men they had never met to keep their word. Brother Stefan looked at his 2 exhausted companions and asked if they were willing to go back one final time. Neither hesitated. They had crossed a line 3 days earlier when they first put on those cursed uniforms, and there was no going back. They would return to the ghetto until they were stopped by bullets or betrayal or the simple mathematical certainty that their luck had finally run out. The 8th trip into the ghetto took place on April 23rd, 1943, nearly 3 weeks into the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and the landscape had transformed into something beyond apocalyptic. The Germans had abandoned any pretense of selective deportation and were simply burning everything, block by block, building by building, incinerating the entire district to force out the last survivors. Flames rose hundreds of feet into the air, visible from across Warsaw, a pyre for an entire people. The smoke was so thick that visibility was reduced to a few dozen yards. Bodies were no longer collected, but simply left where they fell, becoming obstacles to navigate around. The Jewish resistance fighters, down to their last ammunition and fighting from bunkers deep underground, were launching desperate final attacks. German casualties had climbed into the hundreds, an embarrassment for an army that had conquered most of Europe. SS Commander Stroop had committed thousands of troops, tanks, and artillery to crush what remained of Jewish Warsaw, determined to present Hitler with a burned and empty ghetto as a birthday present. Into this inferno walked 3 monks one final time, knowing that this was likely a suicide mission, but unable to abandon the children who remained. The gatehouse checkpoint had been reinforced with additional guards and officers who examined documents with paranoid intensity. The atmosphere had changed. The Germans knew something was wrong, knew that prisoners had been escaping through unauthorized channels, and they were hunting for the source of the leak. Brother Stefan presented their forged documents to a suspicious SS lieutenant who studied every line with the focus of a man whose career depended on catching infiltrators. He asked detailed questions about their orders, about which Gestapo office had issued the authorization, about the specific intelligence objectives of this transfer. Brother Stefan answered each question with invented details, delivered with absolute confidence, but he could see doubt growing in the lieutenant's eyes. The officer was not convinced. He was reaching for his radio to call headquarters for verification when an explosion shook the ground beneath their feet. A Jewish resistance bunker somewhere nearby had detonated explosives, collapsing a building onto a German patrol. The blast sent a shockwave through the street, and chaos erupted instantly. German soldiers rushed toward the source of the explosion, officers screaming orders, medics running to treat wounded troops. In the confusion, the suspicious lieutenant dropped his radio and joined the response, temporarily forgetting about the 3 Gestapo officers and their questionable paperwork. Brother Stefan seized the moment, gathering his companions and walking through the gate while every German eye was focused elsewhere. They had just been saved by the very resistance fighters whose doomed battle had made their rescue mission necessary. It felt like divine intervention, like God himself was providing cover through the courage of Jews who knew they would not survive but fought anyway to buy others a chance at escape. The address they sought was on Franciscanska Street, one of the last areas still partially standing. The building was half collapsed, its upper floors destroyed by German artillery, but intelligence from the underground indicated that a group of 9 children was hidden in a reinforced basement that had survived the bombardment. Brother Stefan led his companions through streets that resembled the surface of the moon, cratered and burning, the air so hot it seared their lungs with each breath. They passed a squad of SS troops using flamethrowers to burn out a bunker, and they had to watch as screaming figures emerged engulfed in flames, running blindly until German machine guns cut them down. They had to keep walking, had to maintain their disguise, had to remain impassive in the face of horrors that would have broken lesser men. When they finally reached the target building, they found the entrance blocked by rubble. They had to dig through debris with their bare hands, tearing away concrete and twisted metal, their Gestapo uniforms covered in ash and blood, until they exposed a gap large enough to crawl through into the darkness below. The basement was pitch black and silent as a tomb. Brother Stefan called out the recognition code in Polish, but heard nothing in response. He called again, louder, identifying himself as being sent by Father Wojciech, using the names of underground contacts, pleading with whoever was hidden in the darkness to reveal themselves. Still nothing. For a terrible moment, Brother Stefan thought they were too late, that the children had already been discovered and taken, that this final desperate mission had been for nothing. Then from the deepest shadow in the corner came the faint sound of breathing. Brother Tomasz lit a small candle they had brought, and the flickering light revealed 9 children huddled together in absolute silence, staring at the German uniforms with eyes that had moved beyond fear into something like acceptance of death. They ranged in age from perhaps 3 to 14, and they were so starved that their bones showed clearly through translucent skin. The oldest, a girl of 14 who had been protecting the younger ones, had positioned herself in front of them with a piece of broken pipe held in her skeletal hands, ready to fight the Nazis with her last breath before they could touch the children she had been left to guard. Brother Stefan removed his Gestapo cap and knelt before her in the darkness. He showed her his rosary. He showed her the brown habit beneath his uniform. And he promised her, as he had promised so many others over the past 3 days, that this rescue was real, and that before nightfall she and every child with her would be free. The girl stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for deception, and then her grip on the pipe loosened, and she began to cry, making no sound, tears simply streaming down her face as her body shook with silent sobs that came from a place deeper than language. Getting 9 children out of the burning ghetto required a modification to their usual strategy. They could not march all 9 in a single group without attracting fatal attention, so they split into 2 teams. Brother Stefan would take 5 children through the main gate using the forged transfer documents. Brothers Tomasz and Karol would take the remaining 4 through a secondary checkpoint on the southern wall, using duplicate papers with slightly different authorization codes. It was an enormous risk to divide their strength, but moving 9 emaciated children through multiple checkpoints as a single unit would trigger too many questions. They synchronized their watches, planned to exit simultaneously so that if one group was discovered, the confusion might allow the other to escape. They wrapped the children in whatever rags could pass for clothing and prepared for what they all knew would likely be their final performance. The girl with the pipe, whose name was Rivka, refused to let go of Brother Stefan's hand as they prepared to leave the basement. She had been alone with those children for 6 days, watching over them while bombs fell and buildings burned, keeping them quiet through sheer force of will, and now she could not quite believe that rescue had actually come. The journey to the checkpoint was a nightmare march through an active battlefield. The Germans had brought in heavy artillery and were shelling the remaining ghetto structures into rubble. Buildings collapsed without warning, sending cascades of brick and concrete into the streets. German soldiers were shooting anything that moved, no longer bothering to determine if targets were resistance fighters or simply desperate civilians. Brother Stefan and his 5 children had to take cover multiple times, pressing themselves into doorways as patrols passed within feet of them. One of the younger children, a boy of perhaps 5, began crying despite all efforts to remain silent. Brother Stefan had no choice but to cover the child's mouth with his hand, feeling the small body shake with terror, hating himself for the necessity of silencing a traumatized child, but knowing that a single cry would doom them all. They moved in short sprints between positions of cover, the smoke providing concealment but also disorientation, making it nearly impossible to maintain their bearings in streets that had been transformed into mazes of destruction. They reached the main checkpoint to find it in chaos. A German ammunition truck had been hit by resistance fire and was burning furiously, secondary explosions sending shrapnel in all directions. Guards were scrambling to establish a perimeter and move the fire away from other vehicles. Brother Stefan made a calculated decision. Instead of waiting for order to be restored, he used the chaos as cover, striding toward the gate with absolute authority and barking orders at confused guards to clear a path for his priority transfer. The performance worked because nobody questions a Gestapo officer during a crisis, when everyone is terrified of making mistakes. They were waved through with barely a glance at their documents, and suddenly they were outside the walls, on the Aryan side, breathing air that did not burn their lungs. Brother Stefan did not slow down, did not show any sign of relief, just kept walking at a measured pace until they were blocks away from the checkpoint. Only then did he allow himself to look back at the children following him and see that all 5 were still there, still alive, still moving toward safety. Brothers Tomasz and Karol were not as fortunate. Their route to the southern checkpoint took them directly through an area where German troops were engaged in close combat with the last resistance fighters. Machine gun fire forced them to detour through a burning building, and one of their children, a girl of 7, inhaled so much smoke that she collapsed. Brother Tomasz carried her while Brother Karol shepherded the other 3, but the delay cost them precious minutes. When they finally reached their checkpoint, the brief window of chaos had passed and order had been restored. The guards were on high alert, examining every person and document with intense scrutiny. The lieutenant reviewing their papers noticed something the others had missed throughout all their previous trips. The authorization stamp was slightly smudged, the purple ink bleeding in a way that suggested reproduction rather than an original seal. It was a tiny detail, invisible unless you were specifically looking for it, but it was enough. The lieutenant's hand moved toward his holster. Brother Tomasz made the kind of decision that defines heroism. He did not try to fight or argue or run. He simply stepped forward, placing himself between the German officer and the children, and began speaking in rapid German, claiming full responsibility for the irregularity in the documents and insisting that the children were innocent assets who needed to reach Gestapo headquarters for interrogation. He was creating a distraction, sacrificing himself to give Brother Karol and the children a chance. The lieutenant hesitated, confused by this Gestapo officer who was suddenly defending Jewish children. In that moment of confusion, Brother Karol grabbed the 4 children and ran. He simply bolted, abandoning all pretense, throwing off his Gestapo cap and sprinting toward the gate with 4 terrified children stumbling after him. German guards shouted and raised their weapons. Brother Tomasz threw himself at the lieutenant, not to harm him but to prevent him from giving the order to fire. Shots rang out. Brother Karol and 3 of the children made it through the gate. The 4th child, the 7-year-old girl, Brother Tomasz, had carried through the smoke, collapsed 5 feet from freedom, struck by a bullet meant for someone else. Brother Tomasz, still wrestling with the lieutenant, saw her fall. And in that moment, something broke inside him that would never be repaired. He released the German officer, stumbled toward the fallen child, and was immediately shot multiple times by guards who had been waiting for a clear target. He died in the gateway between worlds, his blood mixing with that of the child he had tried to save, his brown Franciscan habit finally visible beneath the hated German uniform as his body fell and the coat opened wide. Brother Karol made it back to the monastery with 3 children, collapsing inside the gates and screaming for help, his mind shattered by what he had witnessed. Brother Stefan arrived minutes later with his 5, and together they counted the cost of their final mission. 40 children total had been saved over 8 trips into hell. Brother Tomasz was dead, executed in the gateway to freedom. 1 child had been killed at the checkpoint, and the entire operation was now exposed. Within hours, the Gestapo would identify Brother Tomasz's body, trace his connection to the monastery, and unleash the full fury of the Nazi apparatus on everyone involved. The abbot made the decision immediately. The monastery would be evacuated, the children dispersed through the underground network to hiding places throughout Poland and beyond. The remaining monks scattered, some joining partisan units in the forests, others simply disappearing into the Polish countryside with false identities. The physical monastery would be sacrificed, but the 40 children would survive, hidden in farms and convents and Christian homes across occupied Europe, waiting for liberation that would not come for another 2 years. Brother Stefan and Brother Karol went into deep hiding, never seeing each other again after that terrible April night. Brother Stefan survived the war and lived until 1968, spending his remaining years documenting the rescue operation in journals that he kept hidden in various locations. Brother Karol was not as fortunate. The trauma of watching Brother Tomasz die destroyed something essential in him. He wandered Poland for months after the rescue, unable to return to religious life, unable to reconcile what he had done with who he had been. He was eventually captured by the Gestapo in a random sweep in 1944 and died in Auschwitz. Though whether the Nazis ever connected him to the ghetto rescues remains unknown. Of the 40 children saved, 37 survived the war. 3 died in hiding from disease or subsequent German raids, but 37 lived to see liberation in 1945. They were scattered across Europe and eventually the world, adopted into families who often never told them their true origins, growing up with new names and new identities, carrying with them fragmented memories of monks in German uniforms and a burning city they had somehow escaped. The story was almost lost to history. The communist government that controlled Poland after the war had little interest in celebrating Catholic heroism or Jewish survival. The monastery where the rescue had been coordinated was torn down in the 1950s, replaced by an apartment block with no commemorative plaque. The names of the 3 monks were not recorded in any official capacity. Brother Tomasz's body was buried in an unmarked mass grave, with hundreds of other victims of the ghetto liquidation. For decades, the rescue existed only in scattered survivor testimonies and the hidden journals of Brother Stefan, fragments of an extraordinary story that had no cohesive narrative. It was not until the 1980s, when researchers began systematically documenting Polish rescuers during the Holocaust, that the pieces finally came together. Survivors came forward, now elderly men and women living in Israel, America, Australia, sharing remarkably consistent accounts of monks in Gestapo uniforms who had appeared like guardian angels in the darkest moment of history. Today, the story of the 3 monks exists in academic papers and a few specialized Holocaust histories, but it has never achieved the recognition it deserves. There are no major films, no best-selling books, no prominent memorials. The Catholic Church has never officially canonized brothers Stefan, Tomasz, and Karol, though efforts have been made to recognize them as righteous among the nations. Their heroism was too complicated, too morally ambiguous for easy commemoration. They wore Nazi uniforms. They performed acts of apparent cruelty. They collaborated, even if that collaboration was a disguise meant to subvert the very evil they pretended to serve. How do you celebrate men who saved lives by dressing as murderers? How do you honor sacrifice that required becoming, at least superficially, the thing you despised most? These questions have kept their story marginalized, tucked away in footnotes, known to specialists but invisible to the broader public. And yet, 37 people are alive today because 3 monks decided that some rules were worth breaking, that some disguises were worth wearing, that some sins were worth committing if they served a greater righteousness. The final haunting detail comes from one of the survivors, a woman named Sarah Rosenbaum, who was 8 years old when Brother Stefan carried her out of the ghetto. She lives today in Tel Aviv, now 90 years old, and she keeps a photograph on her mantelpiece that was smuggled out of Warsaw during the war. It shows 3 young monks in their Franciscan habits standing in the monastery courtyard before the war began, smiling at the camera with the innocent confidence of men who believed God would protect them from all harm. She has shown this photograph to her children and grandchildren, 15 descendants who exist because 3 men she barely remembers decided that faith without action was no faith at all. And she ends her testimony with a question that has no comfortable answer. How many more children could have been saved if more people had been willing to become monsters in order to fight monsters? How many lives were lost because good people refused to dirty their hands, refused to compromise their principles, refused to walk through the gates of hell wearing the uniform of the damned? The 3 monks did not ask these questions. They simply put on the uniforms, walked into the fire and pulled 40 children from the flames. The world barely remembers their names, but heaven, if it exists, surely keeps a more accurate record.